Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Battlefield 3 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3, and of course what you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Battlefield 2. It was developed by DICE and published by EA in October of 2011 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3, and it went on to be generally pretty well received across the board, mostly for its multiplayer gameplay and not so much for its single player. Of course, even at the time this was released, that wasn't really anything new for the Battlefield series. They were always multiplayer-focused games anyway, and this comes a year after the release of Bad Company 2, with a considerably different style, going for a much more realistic approach than what Bad Company did, and it also features an updated version of the Frostbite engine, as well as the introduction of a new feature called Battle Log, which basically pushes all of the infrastructure for the game to a web application that you access through your browser instead of actually through the game itself. So it was definitely a noticeable shift from what we saw from previous Battlefield games, but the question really became whether or not that shift was actually a positive one overall. Well, let's go ahead and delve into it and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it was definitely a pretty major step up over the previous Battlefield game, which was Bad Company 2, and the improvements are pretty much across the board. Better texture quality, better shader effects, better particle effects, better lighting effects, and all of it blends together to make a game that actually still holds up very well to this day, even though it is 7 years after the game's release. I mean, you do still see a few issues here and there, namely with the character facial animations, which most of the time aren't particularly accurate, and you do occasionally see a bit of a blurry texture here or there. But most of the time those are either glitches or in places where they don't really expect you to look anyway, so it doesn't end up being that big of a deal. What does end up being much more of a problem, however, are that some of the particle effects, as well as the ridiculous amount of lens flares, makes it very difficult to see what you're doing a lot of the time. They just constantly get in your way, and it just becomes incredibly irritating no matter what. There's also the odd choice of putting a blue filter over all of the visuals in this game, which does give it a bit of an odd color correction quality, which is something they would ultimately fix with Battlefield 4, but in Battlefield 3 it does make everything look slightly off. It's a bit difficult to pin down exactly what's wrong at first. You just look at everything and go, something's not right here, and then you realize later on that there's just this slight blue filter over everything, and it doesn't necessarily make the game look bad, just slightly off. And then of course, while most of the animations are pretty solid, the first-person weapon handling animations are a bit odd as well, mostly with regards to how robotic a lot of them look. But also with regards to hand placement on certain weapons, for example, the way you hold all of the pistols just looks ridiculous because you're curling your entire finger over the trigger, which is something you never really do if you're actually handling a pistol. But issues like that are really just mild annoyances more than anything else, so they never really impact the game all that much. That issue of the particle, smoke, and lens flare effects all making it very difficult to see what you're doing, however, that does get in your way quite a bit. But overall, they've definitely done an excellent job with the visuals, and like I said, they still hold up very well even though it's been several years since the game launched. What doesn't hold up as well, however, is the sound design. Now that's not to say that the overall sound design is bad, it's just that there's one particular aspect of the sound design that is headache-inducing, and that is the soundtrack, which I would describe as glitch-based electronic music, if you can call it music. Most of it is just some very simplistic beats that are just repeated on loop for a considerable amount of time, and while they do use the glitch-based electronic styling to render the Battlefield theme that we all know, it just doesn't really sound very good at all. You gotta remember that the game was released right around the time when dubstep was starting to hit the mainstream, and while this didn't go full-on dubstep for the most part, it does have quite a bit of influence from that genre, and it just ends up making the soundtrack entirely forgettable, as well as extremely dated, and on top of that, it just ends up being garbage. Aside from the music, however, the rest of the sound design is mostly fine. In fact, it's up to the Battlefield standard of quality, which means that explosions are nice, beefy, and concussive, gun sounds have that nice crack of supersonic fire going on, as well as some fairly nice impact behind them, particularly with shotguns, for example. And it really does contribute to the sound of battle around you, just making the game really intense and immersive. Now, unfortunately, that's not something that really happens for the voice acting, which for the most most part, is actually pretty solid, and in the multiplayer at least, it's perfectly fine. But when you go into the single player, a lot of the characters just have really cringe-inducing or facepalm-inducing lines, and it just ends up making the voice acting, while certainly decent enough, just fall flat on its face. It ends up being a situation where the actors put in decent enough performances, but what they're actually performing can't really be salvaged. But overall, the presentation generally earns pretty high marks across the board, and while it does have its missteps here and there, they're not really enough to tank the experience. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although the story definitely takes a backseat because this is primarily a multiplayer-focused game, even though it does have a single-player campaign. We'll go ahead and cover the single player first, though. The game starts out with you hopping aboard a train and fighting your way through a group of heavily armed individuals until eventually you are captured and a guy holds a gun to your head and asks if you're alone. At that point, it cuts over to the interrogation scene, which is there to give you all of the backstory that led up to the train sequence. This means that the vast majority of the storytelling in this game is done entirely through flashbacks, and it's all done in the context of the main player character, who is Sergeant Henry Blackburn, a U.S. Marine, being interrogated for events that only become clear later on when you're actually told exactly why it is he's being interrogated. It's obvious they were trying to create something resembling a suspense thriller storyline, but unfortunately, the storytelling is so all over the place, and the interrogation sequence itself is so laughably poorly done, that it just ends up making the entire story a mess. It's like the interrogators are permanently stuck on Cole Phelps's doubt mode, where they're constantly freaking out about everything, even though it doesn't really help their interrogation out at all, and they tend to go off on tangents all the time, which makes things incredibly annoying. It becomes extremely obvious very quickly that the entire campaign is nothing more than an excuse for big, impressive set-piece moments where they just wanted to show off the capabilities of the Frostbite engine. And the most egregious example of this is when the interrogators ask Sergeant Blackburn about his association with a Lieutenant Hawkins, to which he goes, "I have no idea who that is." And he doesn't, because she has absolutely no relevance to his story at all. The entire sequence of them asking him about Hawkins is just so they can have an excuse to throw you into a jet and have you flying around and doing airstrikes and doing some dogfighting. Except you don't have any control over the jet. Unfortunately, you're just the gunner for it, so you're just sitting there looking at everything while the pilot does all the fancy work. Going off on a complete tangent that has absolutely no relevance to the main story of the game is just terrible writing, and it is all wasted on the fact that it's just a glorified turret sequence. And sure, it's neat to look at, but it very quickly becomes tedious. And the icing on the cake there is that after all of that, Blackburn himself goes, "That's a nice story, I don't see how it connects."
That's a nice story. I don't see how it connects.
What, do I gotta draw you a map? Al Bashir was never there. That's why you went in.
Anyway, to sum things up, you basically go from set piece to set piece and from tangent to tangent until eventually you find out what the actual story is, which is that the guy in the prologue who shoves a gun in your face and asks if you're alone is named Solomon, and he's the ringleader of a group that is basically trying to be a Makarov wannabe. And by that I mean they're initiating two major attacks that will ultimately implicate the Russians and start a war between Russia and the United States. It is a very poor attempt at a generic Tom Clancy rip-off storyline that is basically doing the exact same thing that Modern Warfare 2 and 3 did, only those two games at least had the excuse of being basically Michael Bay movies in video game form. Here they try to take things much more seriously and be a lot more dramatic with their storyline, but it just fails miserably, and it ends up being such a laughably poor storyline that it is completely impossible to give a crap about what's going on. And even if you look past the storyline and try to focus on the single-player gameplay, you find out very quickly that it is one of the most generic modern military shooter campaigns you can possibly imagine. Everything that makes the multiplayer component of the Battlefield series stand out is just completely absent in the single player, with the exception of occasionally opening up the environments a bit, and even then, when it does open them up, it's only in the scale, because they're still extremely linear levels. Beyond that, it's just a generic modern military shooter. You got a 2-weapon limit, you got a melee button, if you come up behind an enemy, you can do a takedown on them. You have various sequences where it's all composed entirely of QuickTime events, only the QuickTime events are just laughably weak, so it never really matters all that much. And the only things to shake up the monotony of just going from point A to point B and slaughtering every single enemy in between is that occasionally it'll put you in a turret and you have to just mow down enemies that are running at you. And it really doesn't help that the enemy AI is very dumb. Most of the time, they'll end up standing out in the middle of the open and give you a clear shot at them. A lot of times, they'll completely ignore you in favor of shooting at your AI teammates who are completely indestructible. And about the only thing that even makes them remotely threatening to you is the fact that they can be pinpoint accurate through smoke and even through cover sometimes. And that's just a really cheap and lazy way of making the game more difficult. In fact, that's all the hard mode does. It just makes the enemy even more pinpoint accurate, and they just do more damage to you. It doesn't affect their actual intelligence at all. And then on top of all of that, you've got all the hallmarks of a very poorly done console port as far as the single-player campaign goes, wherein you have a rather low, nausea-inducing FOV, as well as a lot of button prompts being basically the same. Sometimes the button prompts aren't even correct, and more importantly, there's just so many sequences where you have to stand around waiting for the AI to do something because they don't trust the player with being able to do things like open doors. It's poorly done, it's lazy, it's insulting to your intelligence in a lot of ways, and it just ends up being a campaign that, at the very best, just ends up being boring. And this does ultimately mean that it falls to the multiplayer to bring things up, and thankfully that is where the Battlefield series is focused. Unfortunately, this game never received the update that Battlefield 4 and Hardline did, and that would be continued on into later Battlefield games and Battlefront games as well, in that it doesn't have 60Hz servers, it has 30Hz servers, and there's nothing you can do to change that. To make matters worse, the client send rate is only 10Hz, which means there is a massive discrepancy between what is sending from your PC to the server and what is returning from the server to your PC. This results in a lot of frustration, as for example, you'll run behind cover but you'll still start taking damage because the netcode just hasn't caught up with you yet, or you'll seemingly go down ridiculously fast because it's combining numerous bullets into one super bullet that does all of that damage combined, and it seems like you've just taken one shot when in reality you've taken multiple. Things like that, all of which could have been fixed had they improved the server and client tick rates, but unfortunately they didn't do that with Battlefield 3, and they wouldn't really do it until pretty late in Battlefield 4's development. So even before you get into the particulars of Battlefield 3's multiplayer, you're already running into issues that were present in both Bad Company 1 and 2, and were not fixed by the time Battlefield 3 came out. And then when you do start to get into the particulars, you find that there's issues all over the place with a wide variety of the mechanics as well as the map designs. And we'll go ahead and start with map designs, which are one of the most widely criticized aspects of the game, even from the die-hard fans of it, where the vast majority of maps in this game are really not very well designed, particularly for combined arms play. This is a problem that has absolutely plagued the Frostbite engine Battlefield games ever since the Frostbite engine became a thing, and it's not really because of the engine as much as it is the shift from PC-oriented gaming to console-oriented gaming. You see, before the release of the Bad Company series, the Battlefield series was primarily a PC-centric series, and it was focused more on this team-oriented tactical combined arms gameplay. When you go to console, you have to make a lot of compromises. For one, the console versions of the game are made for 32 players and lower, whereas the PC version is meant for more 64 players. 64 players was the standard for the previous Battlefield games before the series started to go on the console, and when you go to Bad Company 1, Bad Company 2, and of course Battlefield 3, it is painfully obvious that they designed all of the maps around that smaller player count. Unlike in, say, Battlefield 2 or Battlefield 2142, where the maps were pretty wide open and allowed for a lot of flanking maneuvers, as well as a lot more combined arms gameplay, the maps in Battlefield 3 tend to be a lot more cramped and have fewer flanking routes that you can go on, as well as having fewer vehicles on the maps. So instead of having a wide variety of vehicles available for you to hop into and really facilitate that combined arms gameplay, you end up with a lot of people who will hop into tanks and a lot of people who will hop into attack aircraft, and they'll just kind of stay in their own realms. They don't really support the infantry as much as they really should. And while infantry does have some tools to counter ground vehicles with regards to the RPGs and that sort of thing, they don't really have all that much they can do against aircraft that is actually effective anyway, because aircraft all get countermeasures that will just render any sort of lock-on launcher completely pointless against them. I am not at all joking when I say it is easier in most cases to take down enemy aircraft with tank cannons than it is with actual anti-air weapons. This leads to some pretty noticeable balancing issues between infantry, ground vehicles, and aircraft that never really got resolved in the Frostbite engine from here on out. And that's only exacerbated by the map designs, which are either so wide open that they are completely dominated by vehicles, or they're so cramped that they're completely dominated by infantry, and there's really nothing in between. And to make matters worse, a lot of the maps are designed in such a way as to be basically a long corridor, regardless of which mode you're playing, and that makes it painfully obvious those maps were designed around the rush mode. Now, if you're playing rush mode on them, and you're playing with a lower player count of 32 players or less, that's not that big of a deal. But once you expand things out to 64 players, and especially the Conquest mode, that gets really nasty incredibly quickly, and you end up with a complete clusterfuck in the middle of the map where everybody is just constantly fighting and dying, and there's really no ground being gained either way. Now, the worst offender of this is Operation Metro, and Operation Metro, I would argue, is actually the worst map in the entire Battlefield series, but it's really a problem on the vast majority of the maps in this game, where they follow a fairly narrow progression of where the different points on the map go. And while it's fine for rush game mode, for Conquest, it just becomes a mess. And that's a serious problem, because Conquest is the main mode of the Battlefield series. It is what the series is really known for, and Rush is something they just threw into the mix when you got to Battlefield Bad Company. Now, Rush is certainly not a bad mode, but it is definitely not conducive to a 64-player setup, and when you go on PC and nearly all of the servers are 64 players, it becomes painfully obvious extremely quickly that they designed the entirety of Battlefield 3's gameplay experience around 32 players on console and not 64 players on PC, then scaling everything down. And this really does become irreconcilable both on Rush mode if you play with 64 players, and even Conquest mode for 64 players on the vast majority of maps. There's a reason that the only maps people really remember off the top of their head from Battlefield 3 are Operation Metro, for it being the worst map in the series, and Caspian Border, which is about as close as you can really get in Battlefield 3 to the map design of the previous Battlefield games before Bad Company came into the mix. Now you may be thinking, well, what about the DLC maps? Don't they remedy that problem? I mean, the first one is the Back to Karkand expansion, which gives you 4 maps from the previous Battlefield games, specifically Battlefield 2 and Battlefield 1942. Well, there's 3 major issues with that. The first of them is something that is universal to all of the DLCs for Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4, Battlefield Hardline, even Battlefield 1, and that is, if you don't own the DLC, then you actually cannot access any of the content of that DLC. This basically splits the player base into the haves and the have-nots, and there's really no guarantee that everyone's going to have access to all of the same DLCs, because while they did bundle the DLCs together as part of the Premium Pass, which gives you a few other things as well, not everybody decided to get the Premium Pass. Some people just decided they were going to get 1 or 2 of the individual DLCs when they came out. And while they did eventually make the DLCs free, not everybody got in on that. Not everybody went in and specifically activated each individual DLC as it was made free, and those were only available for a limited time anyway. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the vast majority of maps in the DLCs are really no better than what you see in the base game. I mean, sure, Strike at Karkand is one of the better maps in the entire Battlefield series, but it barely plays anything like the map actually played in Battlefield 2, because they actually cut off half of the map. It's actually the same incarnation of the map that's available for 16 players in Battlefield 2, just with a few extra capture points on it. And really, that's the problem with all of the maps in the Back to Karkand expansion. They're all condensed compared to their original incarnations, even if at first glance they seem not to be. It's just that it's easiest to notice it with Strike at Karkand, because an entire section of the map has been effectively chopped off. And even if you look at the new DLC maps that were introduced in the other DLCs for the game, you find that most of them are a bit of a mess too. All of the ones for Armored Kill are focused entirely entirely around vehicle combat and nothing else, while the rest of the DLCs are focused almost exclusively on infantry combat. One of them is devoted entirely to it, and it's called Close Quarters, whereas the others are Aftermath and Endgame, both of which tend to be more infantry focused as well. That means that the main thing that the Battlefield series is known for, that combined arms gameplay, is not something that any of the maps are really designed for. So that's your second major problem with the DLCs, and then there's the third major problem, which is that the vast majority of servers that are actually accessible and actually have players in them are either 24/7 single map servers, or they have a very small number of maps in rotation. And most of those maps aren't even DLC maps. And you may be thinking to yourself, oh, well, DW, that's because there's barely anybody still playing Battlefield 3. But even back when it was still heavily populated, that was still the case. Hell, people barely even use the DLC weapons. They just stick with the stuff that's in the base game because, frankly, it's better than what's introduced in the DLCs. I mean, to give you a prime example, the best weapon in the game, bar none, is the M16A3, which is only available for the Assault class, and only available for the US side until eventually you unlock it for the Russian side as well later on in the progression. And it effectively has absolutely no downsides whatsoever, except that at very long ranges, it's outclassed by sniper rifles. The best weapon for the engineer kit is arguably the Scar H, which is also a base game weapon. The best weapon for the support class is a bit debatable, but it's probably the PKP, which is again a base game weapon. And then, of course, with Recon, the best weapon is the M98 Bravo, which is, you guessed it, a base game weapon. And while that's good in the sense that you don't have to own any of the DLCs in order to have the best weapons, and therefore the game is not pay to win, unfortunately, the M16A3 is only available for one side unless you spend an awfully long time in the progression. The Scar H requires a bit of progression to get. The PKP is right in the middle of the support class progression. And then finally, when you get to the Recon class, the M98 Bravo is the last sniper rifle you unlock. Well, not counting the faction-specific weapons that you start the game with for all of the classes that you eventually unlock for the other class. Those are actually the final unlocks in all of the progression for that particular class, but that's beside the point. The point is that the weapons in the base game are superior to the ones in the DLCs, so pretty much nobody uses them online. Instead, they are relegated to either very situational use, or people who just really want to use something that is not the established norm. So the DLCs end up being more of a waste than anything else, because sure, they add 20 maps, but how many of those are you actually going to be able to play? And while I've brought up the progression system in talking about the DLC weapons versus the base game weapons, I might as well talk about the progression system in general, because it's one of the more egregious problems that you'll find in Battlefield 3. You have progression based on your overall ranking, as well as each individual class rank and each individual vehicle type rank. So as you continue to play the game, you'll get overall points as well as points that go directly into your class based on your various class actions and such. And as you accumulate points, you'll gradually unlock new weapons, new gadgets, that sort of thing, all of which change what you're actually able to do with that particular class. And of course, as you continue to earn points in general, that all goes into your overall rank, which will give you access to new pistols, new universal weapons, that sort of thing. And when you go into the vehicles and continue to earn more points with those, you'll earn new attachments for those particular vehicles. In theory, that sounds perfectly fine, right? Well, it's actually a pretty significant problem, because it means that people who've simply played the game longer aren't just better by nature of being more used to the way the guns recoil, being used to the way the maps are, that sort of thing. They simply have a better class loadout than you do. And in particular, when you go on one side or the other and you're going up against, say, M16A3s and you don't have access to it, well, that's a pretty nasty issue because, again, that is the best weapon in the game, and it has effectively no downsides, whereas even the other side's weapon, the AK-74, does have some fairly noticeable downsides. But it's not simply that you unlock different weapons, it's also that as you continue to use those weapons and get kills with them, you unlock new attachments for them. So maybe one particular weapon works best with a certain kind of sight, or you need a foregrip to really tame the recoil of it, or whatever the case may be, and for someone who hasn't unlocked all of that stuff, that can be extremely frustrating to deal with. Because with the exception of those few weapons I've mentioned already, most of the weapons are generally just side grades to one another and are better in certain situations than others, but in most cases they require specific attachments to really be at their most viable. And if you don't have those attachments, well, you're at a disadvantage. To make matters worse, the Assault class is also the medic, and it does not unlock the defibrillator until at least 4,000 points into the progression. Now, it's not at all difficult to get that many points, but it means that until you've gotten to that point, one of the main reasons to play the Assault class, the ability to revive your teammates, is simply not accessible to you. So at that point, the Assault class isn't really a proper medic as much as it is just a rifleman who can throw healing crates around. None of the other classes have that problem. They have all of their main gadgets right from the get-go, so it's just odd that they've set up the progression the way they have, and to make matters worse, that unlock system is pervasive throughout everything, because like I said, the vehicles progress as well, and you gradually unlock new attachments that dramatically increase the capabilities of your vehicles, but that requires you to be in those vehicles quite a lot. So the game ends up requiring quite a bit of grinding to actually be competitive, and it's not simply learning the maps, it's not simply getting used to the way the guns recoil, it's not simply getting used to working together as a team, it's simply playing the game longer to get more stuff so you can actually be on the same level as everybody else. But the really messed up part of this is that EA knew it was a grind and they knew people would be irritated by it, so they put in something to squeeze a bit more money out of their player base, which is the shortcut bundles. What's that? Don't want to grind out the 220,000 points it would take you to unlock all of the things for the Assault class? Well, you can just pay $7 and get all of that stuff unlocked instantly. Don't want to grind out all the vehicles? Well, just pay $18 and all of it's unlocked right from the get-go. Or if you just want to unlock everything without even putting in any ounce of grinding, well, just pay $40 and they'll unlock everything for you, right from the start. As long as you pay out extra money, they're willing to give it to you. Now, of course, they're no substitute for learning the maps and working together as a team and getting the recoil control down, and they don't unlock all of the attachments for the weapons, they only unlock the weapons themselves. But it is still a very disgusting practice, and the fact that they're still selling the shortcut packs to this day is pretty insulting. So while the idea of putting a progression system in the game, particularly with as much content as this has, isn't necessarily the worst, it's implemented in such a way that it causes serious balancing problems on top of an already fairly unbalanced game to begin with. I mean, when you look at the class balancing, the Recon class is basically the I'm going to stand as far away from the action as possible and just snipe from really long distance class, while the Assault, Support, and Engineer classes are usually right in the thick of the battle and are all useful in their own ways, with Support being able to resupply ammo and provide suppressing fire, the Engineer being able to provide anti-vehicle capabilities, and the Assault class being able to do healing as well as revives. But you still find that even among those three classes, where they're usually right in the thick of things, the Assault class is the one that people play the absolute most, because, again, with the M16A3 being the best gun in the game, people just want to use that all the time. And when you combine all of those issues with the rather significant shift in who is actually playing the Battlefield games, which these days is really no longer people who were playing the old school Battlefield games, but rather a bunch of people who migrated over from Call of Duty, you end up with an absolute mess of a game that just ends up being extremely frustrating most of the time. But here's the thing. Every so often, usually if you're playing on the Caspian border map in particular, you occasionally get those moments where everything just synergizes, and you can see the glimpses of what could have been by actually playing together with a proper team who communicates really well and makes significant pushes towards the objectives, and actually plays it like, you know, a Battlefield game. And it's moments like that that people remember so fondly from Battlefield 3. The problem is, those moments are so few and far between that they may as well not even exist. Because the vast majority of the Battlefield 3 experience is a game that doesn't really know what it wants to be, and just ends up being a shoddy mashup of some ideas from previous Battlefield games mixed in with something that really feels like it's trying to compete directly with Call of Duty, instead of realizing what it actually was to begin with. Something that never really was competing with Call of Duty in the first place. The old Battlefield games really didn't have much to do with Call of Duty at all. They were more running in parallel. People who wanted that more tactical, team-oriented, combined arms experience went with the Battlefield series, and people who wanted more of a fast-paced run-and-gun arcade first-person shooter went with the Call of Duty games, and there was just kind of a happy harmony there. But then there were a wide variety of factors that ultimately led to EA deciding it would be a direct competition between this and Call of Duty, and if there's anything the games industry has taught us, it's that trying to compete with Call of Duty and win over the dollars that go into that series is a terrible idea. And that ultimately led to Battlefield 3 being an absolute mess of a game overall. And it really doesn't help that even to this day, you have to go through the battle log system to actually be able to do anything. And while the idea of battle log as a stat tracking website that allows you to modify your loadouts while in your web browser and you don't even have to go into the game, or being able to track a ludicrous number of stats for whatever playstyle you want, or being able to keep track of all the different assignments that you have, which are basically your achievements, and what you've unlocked, what you've got coming up, all that sort of thing, is all perfectly fine. Unfortunately, they also rolled the server browser into it, they rolled the campaign launch option into it, and they rolled the co-op launch option into it, where the game does have co-op, but most of the time it barely even functions, if at all. And the co-op missions themselves are just basically repackaged single-player missions with slightly different parameters that usually just end up being an absolute mess to play through. But I digress. Battlelog just ends up being a hindrance more than anything else that gets in your way. I mean, you have to download additional plugins to actually be able to use it properly, and you can't modify your key bindings or your graphics options or sound options or anything like that through Battlelog. You have to do that all once you're in the game, so you end up having to jump into the game, hop into a server, and then while you're sitting there in the deploy menu, you're going to hop into your menu and mess around with the graphics settings, mess around with all of your audio and controls and everything, and you just end up wondering why the hell they force you to use Battlelog to be able to do functions that ordinarily would just be in the game menus themselves. And they never really had an answer for that. They just kept forcing you to use Battlelog with it, and that would continue on into Battlefield 4 and Hardline, up until pretty recently anyway, which I'll get to in another video. But suffice to say, Battlefield 3 is just an absolute mess. There's not really a whole lot to praise about it that isn't simply visuals and sound design, and when you actually go into the game proper, you find that the vast majority of the good ideas in it are simply carryovers from previous Battlefield games that are implemented far more poorly, and there's not really anything in the game that truly capitalizes on what made the Battlefield series interesting to begin with. And while there are certainly worse games in the series than this was intended to be a proper sequel to Battlefield 2, and it really just isn't. Ultimately, I give it a 1.5 out of 5, and that's including all of the DLCs, because, as I mentioned before, the DLCs are almost worthless to actually own. Thanks for watching.